he's not a historian. I think he was talking about when he was introduced, it was as a social scientist.
Yes, I don't.
Yeah, I wonder what department he's in. Anyway.
We can look in our little.
Well, yeah. Oh, that's right.
Ready?
We are ready.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Lynn Bassanese, the director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the keynote address of our 11th annual Roosevelt Reading Festival. When FDR created this presidential library and gave his home to the American people, his hope was that people would visit here and learn from the past so they would be able to create a better future for themselves. That mission of discovery and learning is something we take very seriously here. And by welcoming visitors from all over the world and offering interesting and innovative public programs like the Roosevelt Reading Festival, we try very hard to fulfill that mission. It is also our way of showcasing just how completely Roosevelt's vision for the library as a research institution is being fulfilled by a variety of authors who produce books of all kinds and on a wide variety of subjects. The work of the authors that have gathered here today is evidence that there is still much that can be learned and great inspiration drawn from the Roosevelt era. I thank all of them for being with us today. And through the generosity of C-SPAN, we're able to share our 11th annual Roosevelt Reading Festival with a grand audience across the country. None of this would be possible without the creative and dynamic staff of the Roosevelt Library and our generous and talented volunteers, and I thank them so much for their help. Last June, the museum opened new, exciting, and interactive exhibits, a $6 million investment in the future, our effort to present the New Deal to a new generation, our belief that the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt is still so relevant today, and the world we live in is the world that they created. Our library and our new exhibits reflect the spirit of the Roosevelts, optimism combined with a single-mindedness of purpose, always carried out with good humor in the face of the greatest challenges. I hope all of you have the chance to see our new museum and return often with family and friends. And now it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker. James Tobin is professor of media, journalism, and film at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Educated at the University of Michigan, where he earned a PhD in history, he spent 20 years as a newspaper reporter and freelance writer. Among his books are Ernie Pyle's War, America's Eyewitness to World War II, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award in biography, To Conquer the Air, the Wright Brothers and the Great Race for Flight, which the Wall Street Journal recently named one of the 5 best books about invention. And of course, the wonderful book that he'll be talking about this afternoon, The Man He Became, How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency. The powerful story of the greatest comeback in American political history. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome James Tobin.
Thank you, Lynn. What a pleasure to be here. What an honor to be here and to be asked to speak at the home of these two extraordinary people. I had breakfast this morning with a great Roosevelt authority and a wonderful person, Ken Moody, who probably knows more about the land that we're standing and seated on than the whole National Park Service put together. Ken's book, FDR and His Hudson Valley Neighbors, is recently published. A wonderful book based on many, many years of study and research. Ken is a guy from Louisiana, spending his life up here in Yankee country, and he still has a way of using his Louisiana drawl to put a guy like me in his place. He said, Jim, you know, it says on the book flap that you teach narrative nonfiction. I never quite understood. What is the difference between nonfiction and narrative nonfiction? And so I came back with my favorite little anecdote about that, which is a quote from the great narrative historian Robert Massey, whom most of you will know chiefly as the author of Nicholas and Alexandra, another journalist turned historian. He has written a series of books about Russian history, great biographies. And at the time that he published his superb biography of Peter the Great, he appeared on C-SPAN with the great Brian Lamb, who said at one point in the interview, well, Mr. Massey, you know, a lot of academic historians are looking at your book and saying, well, we already know all of this about Peter. Why should we read this book? Why should this book be published? What do you say to those academic historians, Mr. Massey? And Massey thought for a second and he said, well, I say, yeah, you guys know about it, but nobody else knows about it. Academic historians make an argument, present an analysis. Narrative historians try to tell a story, to be read principally for pleasure. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other, one is more important than the other. I argue for coexistence of these two warring hemispheres. I went to my publisher and I said, I've got a great story to tell, the story of FDR and polio. And they bought it. And then I thought, oh no, what have I done? What can I possibly say about Franklin Roosevelt and polio that everybody doesn't know already? I was nervous, I was scared. So I came here next door to the library and I began to ask for boxes and I began to turn pages. That's what Robert Caro, the great biographer of Lyndon Johnson, said. They asked him, well, how did you do it? He said, I asked for the boxes and I turned every page. Now, there's more material at the Lyndon Johnson Library than there is even here, and I certainly don't claim to have turned every page over there, but I turned a sizable fraction. This was my time span. 1921 to 1932, the 20s in FDR's life, not the period that is best known among those who have read the Roosevelt biographies. The key events, of course, after being defeated in his run for the vice presidency in 1920 were that he contracted polio in the summer of 1921. He nominated Al Smith for the presidency in 1924, a great political alliance that later fractured. He became associated with Warm Springs, Georgia, and bought the place in 1926. He was elected governor of New York in 1928, re-elected in 1930, and then elected president in 1932. My question was, how did he get from here, contracting polio, when his career was absolutely shattered? You cannot understand this story unless you understand that he was absolutely finished as a politician in the summer of 1921. Everybody thought so, everybody, including his wife. How did he get from here over to here in just these few short years? Well, as Americans, we've told ourselves two stories about that passage. One, the older story, is the one I was told when I was a little kid in the 1960s by my grandmother, a great New Dealer, a great lover of FDR, taught music in the Detroit public schools. She took me aside when I was 6 or 7 years old, and she told me a story of this heroic president who had crossed a stage by himself on crutches, even though he had polio, which I knew about because I'd had the sugar cube. I knew about this terrible, dreadful disease that had recently been cured. We had been saved from this by the vaccine. And so that image of a heroic man who had braved his own recovery, who had come back, that was the story in my mind, and that was the story in most Americans' minds in those days. As I began to work on this book, however, I started to realize that a new narrative had taken hold among many people, especially younger Americans. That was a story about deception, a belief that he could not possibly have been elected president if that generation had known that he had polio. This is a generation that has grown up in the period since Richard Nixon and Watergate, has lived through Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, has lived through George W. Bush and weapons of mass destruction, a generation that believes what do presidents do? They lie. They deceive us. The terrible, cynical thing that we've come that has come to prevail in our public discourse. Well, as I turned those pages, I came to learn neither of those narratives were the whole story.